2018, Jake Phelps, the editor-in-chief of Thrasher, announced the death of Mark, aka Monk Hubbard, with really no explanation about how he died or why he died or anything like that. Jake Phelps basically said that he passed away in his home in West Seattle, and that was really all the information that the skate community really knew about. Now, Jake later went on to die from a very similar cause, almost like about a year later. So it's a very touchy topic that we're going to get into today. The amount of skateboarders that end up doing cocaine, heroin, drugs like that, it's a secrecy. There's a lot of skaters that do it. Unfortunately, the amount of fentanyl that is cut into cocaine and heroin, etc., is really high as well. So it's creating a really toxic environment essentially for skaters that are associated with drugs, which is a big majority of skateboarders, and that is something that's just not really talked about. It's a big problem in general right now with society. This isn't just narrowed down to skaters. However, I do want to specifically talk about our community members and how we can hopefully make some change. In this video, I really don't want to focus on the how skaters get and fall into these positions of wanting to try drugs or depressed or any of that. I've made videos about that before. In this video, I really want to focus about like the secrecy of overdose and the death of these skaters. Jake Phelps, Jeff Grosso, David Barr, I mean, many skaters, some that I can't even really say, we'll get into that in a little bit, have died essentially from fentanyl overdoses, all within the past couple years. These are all skateboarders that have been accepted and given platforms from the skate community, the skate industry, especially someone like Jake Phelps. Now, after all these different skaters have died in the last couple years, it's been tragic. It's been a flood of love on the Instagram and stuff like that, announcing like their appreciation for these skaters and how they contribute to the community, showing their appreciation to their families and everything like that. And I think that's like really goes to show how much these people really had a positive impact on so many lives. Now, while my channel is normally just about like skateboarding, DIY, and some fun stuff for the most part, my passions, sometimes we have to stop and have these more critical, deep conversations that are very hard to have, to be honest, but it's important, and this is something that's really important to me. Now, the reason that I feel inclined to talk about this and more comfortable to talk about this is because Jake Phelps' sister Marie essentially opened up and advocated for people talking about this topic and making it more public and not having it such a secret conversation. So obviously, as a disclaimer, I don't want to say that anything I say in this video is factual information that should be used for anything other than just absorb overarching message. Don't take things out of context. This is a really hard conversation. I have to be vulnerable. I have to stick my neck out and have this conversation here on video. It's not easy for me, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I don't want sympathy. All I'm trying to say is just please understand that I don't know everything that I'm talking about. However, I think it's important to at least try to open up the conversation. A researcher at Harvard University published a study about how stigma is hindering society's response to the overdose crisis. This isn't just in skating. He said that families withhold this information are likely anticipating the shame that could be placed upon people associated with a victim of an overdose. Now, the key word there is victim. Now, I want to make that very important. Everything we talk about, these are victims regardless if they made their choices and they did what they did. I still believe they are a victim of overdose. Now, I think this is also why a lot of families make the choice not to make this public information, because I think they want their sons, daughters, whoever they may be, to be remembered for the good and the positive things that they did for the skate community. And I think sometimes that is a hard thing for people to sort of balance. Is like, hey, do we want to tell people about how he died, or do we want them just to remember him for who he was? And I think you can do both. You can remember people for all the positive impact, but we can also learn from their whole lives from beginning to end, and how they end maybe could be a way for us to learn from as well. It doesn't mean that we have to remember them for that, and I think it's really important. So I'm going to reference two articles from the San Francisco Standard that go directly into today's topic. The owner of Thrasher magazine, Tony Vitello, was Jake Phelps' boss, and I think it's really important to acknowledge Tony and his role in playing with all of this. Tony inherited Thrasher magazine from his father, Fausto, who invented independent trucks. Tony grew up idolizing Phelps before eventually becoming his boss. However, recently, Tony has admitted that he felt guilty about covering up Phelps' addiction, which I think, again, makes me feel more inclined to make this video and talk about this. Tony kept news of Phelps' fentanyl overdose out of the pages of Thrasher magazine, and still to this day. I remember seeing thousands and hundreds of Jake Phelps RIP posts on social media at this time. It seemed like everyone I knew was a fan of Phelps and wanted to share empathy to the situation. Now, I couldn't help myself but to feel weird about this entire public display of love for someone without any understanding of what really happened. It's like they're already gone, but we don't know why. Typically, when there is no explanation of why we lose these people, there's a sense of shame. I do think people enable of Jake to become a character to keep selling Thrasher products. At the time, I had my assumptions about the cause of death, but assumptions are not something I want to publicly air out in the respect of hurting or damaging others. Now, this is taken directly from the SF Standard. Quote, beyond his role in figurehead and face of Thrasher, Tony recalled Phelps as the embodiment of Thrasher magazine's 1990s motto, skate and destroy. Now, in my opinion, the secrecy and hiding this whole thing is actually what creates a bigger problem than it does create a solution or even make people remember for the good. I think it just creates a bigger problem. Ultimately, it kind of just allows everyone to continue on with their lives and continue on what's going on without addressing the problem. And there is a problem. I grew up seeing drugs at a very young age, and some parents might shelter their kids from the reality that drugs play in their society. But that's not how I grew up. I saw the direct implications of what drugs will do to people. Not to say I'm innocent, but something about it not being a secret allowed me to better understand the consequences. And I think that's kind of where we're at as now with skateboarders in the community. Like, unless we know the consequences of these lifestyles, then we're never gonna learn and become even better and optimize and just do better and learn from elders. We shouldn't just be repeating what's already been done over and over. While filming for King of the Road, Tony Vitello recalls Phelps showing up one day super intoxicated. Tony said he threatened to end the production if the vice director didn't agree to delete the tapes. Later on that day, Tony took Phelps' car keys and threatened to fire him if he was caught driving again. To me, this is like a clear sign that something needs to change and somebody needs to step in, intervene, and just do something, because at this point, if you don't, you're sort of enabling this man or this person in these situations. Tony is not responsible for anyone's death. Ultimately, Jake is responsible for Jake. This is true. However, Jake is just like an example of so many other skaters at this point. We have to eventually ask ourselves, like, how is this going to stop? How do we prevent more of this from happening? Now, if I'm personally in the position to empower somebody or enable them, like if they came to me and they really wanted the dead truth, I would feel like I need to empower them and not enable them. So sometimes that might be meaning losing a friend and they might be mad that you don't agree with them. But however, I think that's part of the process of not enabling somebody and empowering them. It's just being brutally honest. Not brutally honest, but just being honest and having empathy with that honesty. Having a talk with your friend or loved one or just someone you occasionally see at the skate park about your perception of their drug abuse is extremely difficult, which is why most people avoid it altogether, assuming it's somebody else's responsibility and not theirs. I think we need more training in the skate community in order to deal with these situations on a very serious but strategic level. The reality is you can't help someone that isn't willing to help themselves, but you can also make a choice to not enable someone to make choices you know that are going to directly and negatively affect them. The part about addiction is your perception and the perception of the individual using are typically extremely opposite. But coming from a sober position, you need to be empathetic and willing to be uncomfortable with things to get someone you love the help that they need. This is a quote directly from Tony. We've been trying to address the conversation more. Addressing alcohol-related issues in the magazine is not necessarily glorifying the partying. Unfortunately, there's a marketability to that behavior and to those lifestyles, and people use it to sell things. Everybody's guilty of that to a certain extent. So at this point, you got to ask yourself, like, what's more important, selling some product, or is it the human beings and the people that are there helping you sell that product? Skateboarding is about individuality. Sometimes that makes skaters feel alone in the process of being vulnerable with their emotions. I've had my own friends die from overdoses of drugs. I've had my family members die from overdoses of drugs. So talking about these things is something I don't plan to stop. The objective of this video isn't to shame anyone or force accountability onto one individual for multiple skaters' deaths due to fentanyl. The objective is to have a vulnerable conversation about the issue I found more common in our community, the acceptance of drug abuse. I think most skaters, including myself, get stuck with opening up about this conversation because of the potential backlash. Let's learn and honor those skaters by having an open conversation about the hard reality of skaters on drugs. I think most skaters are scared to open up about this kind of topic is because of the backlash and like sort of the consequences that can come with it and like sticking your neck out. Like if I'm sitting here talking about this and, you know, all of Jake's family is saying, hey, don't talk about this or something like that, then like that makes me sort of a bad person. And that's not what I'm saying skaters should be doing. However, what I'm trying to say is like, we should just be more open about the conversation, so like not shaming people for their addictions and just having more vulnerable conversations. Being alone right now here in Fallbrook on this ramp, I can talk about this, but like if I was at a skate park with tons of other people, obviously I have to be walking more on eggshells because there's a lot of sensitivity to these topics. And I think with that creates restraint for skaters not to want to talk about it because they don't want to be wrong. But I don't think you necessarily have to be right in this conversation. You just have to be willing to be vulnerable and learn and just talk about it. Like I said in the beginning of this video, nothing I say is factual information. I don't want this to be used for anything else. However, I want to open up that line of communication.